Hi everybody. In this video, we're going to start refining this model just a bit more to get some of the details back in and to get this to a more of a complete state for its proper block in. So I'm going to just pull this shape up a little bit more, and I am going to reduce that sort of taper just a little bit there, just because it looked a little bit too extreme in this case when comparing with the concept. Now I do want to block in some of these legs in the first place here. So one of the ways that I can do that is actually just take from what already exists. Let's just take these two sides here. Let's just pull that out a little bit. I'm just going to clone this to an object instead. And in this case as well, let's just grab that section there. Pull this over so that we've got all the shape that we need here all set up for us right away. And what I am going to do in this case as well is just center the pivot on my object. I'm actually also going to use my snaps to drag the pivot point right to the edge here. That way, I can toss down a symmetry modifier. Now, I've been going through this list a lot, and I'd actually like to speed this up a little bit more again. So I'm going to use my Configure Modifier Sets button here. And you can go in here and you can configure your modifier set so that you can have a list of little buttons that you can work with. Now, in this case, I've grabbed, so basically you can just grab whatever you want here. If you wanted like editable poly or editable spline in any of these various pieces, you can do that. Now, for example, I'm just going to toss down editable poly. If you wanted more buttons, you can add them, or less buttons. But these are the modifiers that I'm using at the moment, and you can just scroll through here and grab whatever it is that you use most frequently. I'm going to just say OK. I'm going to go back over here and say Show Buttons, and you can see this list of just quick modifiers that you can toss down. Very, very useful to have, because I can now press just Symmetry, for example. Now, in this case, I can click my Symmetry again here, use Rotate, and I can rotate that mirror, again, by about 45 degrees here, so that I get this nice cut, so that wherever I place this geometry, it's going to create a nice cut here. And it's going to be symmetrical on both sides. This is really handy for me. I'm using that Shift-S Swift Loop again here, just to kind of create that basic shape that I want. So I can pull this out and put this in kind of whatever direction that I want. In fact, I could even delete this section of the model. I really don't need that. And here we go. I'm just going to push this down a little bit. The base of my model will actually just go underneath here. It's not too bad for us to do this right now. I'm just going to do this a little bit as well, just to kind of pull this shape in just a little bit. Now, sometimes you may end up in a situation in which, as you're blocking something like this out, you're realizing that the shape that's in the concept is not quite reading as well as you'd like in the real version, in the 3D version. So you can obviously change those things. Make sure that the thing looks best in 3D, because sometimes a concept artist doesn't always get those shapes perfectly. So you just want to make sure that you're working with what works best in game, so in 3D. Now, for example, I do want to take this, and I'm going to do one more adjustment here. I do want some more symmetry going on. Now, this symmetry modifier, however, I want to be centered on the model. So I'll click that symmetry again. I'm going to go to Align and click my model, so it's going to be set to the center. So that's going to be perfect for us. Now I can go with this symmetry. I can say Flip on the X-axis, and I'm just going to copy this and paste again, but on the Y-axis this time. And again, I'm just going to adjust the symmetry modifier so that it goes to this point. It wasn't maintaining the pivot point of this one, so that's not a big deal. There we go. We just center again, and we've got a nice setup. And again, I'm just going to use my shell modifier to kind of pull that shape out and get something quite a bit more reasonable. Let's just pull that in a bit here, so I get a nice big blocky shape to work with here. And at this point now I can start kind of just pulling some of these things out. All these details are going to work really, really nicely here. I can kind of see how it's going to look from the side. I can start to kind of pull this up. And again, it's worth just trying to make sure that you check your model from the appropriate angles. So as we can see from our concepts, if we just go back to our angles here, we can see what is the appropriate angle that we're supposed to be seeing this stuff from. It's useful for us to see this because the more often we can see what that angle is going to be, the more we can kind of compare with our actual concept, our model, to just make sure that that's going to look the way that it should. Especially from afar, you want that silhouette to read really nicely. This stage of the modeling is really, really important. You got a lot of wiggle room that you can work with here, but if you don't set up things properly at this stage or in a way that's going to work well for you later, it can get kind of frustrating to work with. So even though in this case the model is actually supposed to be totally flat based on that concept. I think it ends up looking quite a bit more interesting to kind of just pull this edge out a little bit more. Still maintains a lot of the triangle shapes that exists in the actual world, but it gives us something just a little bit more interesting to work with here. We can, of course, just adjust any of these edges to give ourselves something a little bit more interesting to work with. But all of that works out pretty decently. You can always kind of push these edges around just to kind of see what kind of shapes you get. So you can modify them afterwards just to make sure they're clean and interesting as well. Let's deal with that top section up here as well now. So one thing that I want to do here is just take this section and let's just duplicate it as well. Just like we were doing before, we'll use a shell for this in this case. Pick that section. Got to get the right, just got to click a couple times to get the right selection here. There we go. Let's just pull this over. Same with these edges here. You can just press F3 just to see through your model, just to make sure your angles are getting right. That looks pretty decent. Again, I'll just press Control 1 to get a loop. Pull that out a little bit more here. And we can use a shell to push all this out. So, in fact, in this case, I'm just going to push out on this shape. Sometimes you get the kind of shapes that you want, sometimes you don't. It kind of depends in certain scenarios what you're getting here. What I am going to do is select both sides here, and I want to kind of connect this up together so that I can get this shape. But I'm going to need to do just a little bit of an adjustment here. So you can see here, I do want to raise this up, but if I just raise it, it's not going to get the angle quite right, so that's going to be annoying. What I want to do is go over to Edge Constraint. That way, when I drag this up, the edge is going to stay constrained to that edge, and that'll work just fine. So I can click, let's just come back here. There we go. Come back here, pick these two edges, and we can just bridge that together. And I'm going to do another edge selection here right through the center. Control Shift E to connect through, and then I'm going to Control Shift C to just kind of drag out this point through here. So that'll work pretty decently, because now what I can do is just do another connection through here just to kind of establish some of the edges that I might want to go down. So that works pretty decent, and I can just shift drag down. So what I'm basically doing here is just kind of creating a few extra edges for myself to work with here. Kind of just snap this to the base here, and just kind of connect this over. If at any point you're thinking like, oh, this is getting really laborious, I don't want to have to do this on both sides, just toss down that symmetry modifier. In this case, again, I will Effect Pivot Only, center on my object, and then I will do my symmetry modifier here on that axis. There we go. That way, all this gets kind of fixed up and cleaned up, and we can just connect these two pieces together and just drag this over to the right kind of angle. Shift X turns on constraints, and we can just kind of pull that up to create that shape that we actually want in this scenario. And so that works out pretty decently. Now, of course, again, I can just drop down a new symmetry modifier, but simply adjust its pivot to the center of this object, say OK, flip, and now we get both of those sections kind of built out. One thing you want to be careful with shell is it can tend to create curves where it doesn't need to, or shapes that are not quite exactly what you're looking for. It's not a big deal all the time, but you just want to be aware of it. Just watch out for certain situations in which it's not creating the size that you want. Also, because we're building this extra element here, you just want to make sure that the size of these things matches up. So for example, if this is going to push out, you want to make sure that that goes in the right direction. You can see this angle is not quite right either. So you just got to watch out for a few of those things. This starts to get a little bit too deep, while this is not deep enough. So we just want to push some of this down a little bit, and we can make modifications ourselves after the fact. So that works out pretty decent. Let's just pull this down to this one. Maybe even down here as well, so that that symmetry just kind of duplicates over top of everything else. So now that we've got a lot of these bigger shapes kind of figured out, we can basically just start moving on in our next video into some of the smaller elements that are still really important for this structure.